Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may are. Thank you for joining us for this week's community meeting, Kubernetes community meeting. Friendly reminder, this meeting is recorded. It is also streamed live. So if there's something you want to say, make sure you want to say it to everyone in the world. There's also a code of conduct. Please be mindful of that as well. I think that's it for me. So without further ado, Dave Strebel will run the demo today on Kubernetes Policy Controller. Dave, you are muted.
There we go.
Okay.
So my name's Dave Strebel. I'm a open source architect at Microsoft, and today I'll talk about and demo Gatekeeper, which is a policy controller for Kubernetes. So if you look at what Gatekeeper is and where it kind of came from, there was two projects announced back in probably around October timeframe, which was the Kubernetes policy controller and one called Gatekeeper. They both solved kind of the same issues around policy, but they were separate projects. So those came to merge into the open policy agent, as the open policy agent is really the magic behind the policy controllers. They both kind of had kind of different directions, but the cool thing I think here is that kind of the community and ecosystem consolidated. They're trying to solve the same problems. And that also brought in a lot of other companies and end users collaborating on this policy controller, which is going to be officially called Gatekeeper. This is in pretty heavy development, taking some of the stuff from the previous projects and also doing kind of a refactoring on it. So some of the stuff I was showing the demo today is kind of based on the older policy controller, but I will talk about what the components are of this. The first thing to know is really the magic behind it is using the Open Policy Agent. If you're not familiar with the Open Policy Agent, it is a CNCF hosted project. It's a general purpose policy engine, so it's just not for Kubernetes. There are end users out there using it for Kubernetes. Capital One, which did a KubeCon talk on how they're utilizing it. There's also like Netflix, they use it for protecting SSH into their Linux host. It can also be used for things around, protecting different APIs like SDO API, Linkerd, Cloud Foundry, things like that. Today, I'll talk about it in the form of what it provides you from a Kubernetes standpoint. So what it actually uses is a declarative policy language called Rigo. This came from a long time ago, what was called Datalog. And it's really focused on protecting the Kubernetes API. If you look at other policies within Kubernetes, for instance, like network policy, pod security policy, that's focused at kind of protecting at runtime, versus where the policy controller is more focused on at create time. So some basic scenarios for the actual policy controller. A few different things it does is from admission, authorization, and audit. So these can answer different questions like maybe I want to whitelist or blacklist different registries. So it has to come from a specific URL. And if that doesn't match, then it invalidates that. And this is all really based on how it ties in is through admission control. So being able to utilize things like mutating webhooks and validating webhooks. We can also do things like not allow conflicting hosts for ingresses. So maybe we have the same host name that's defined in our object across different namespaces. It could also deny requests like that. We can also mutate objects on the fly too. So if somebody submits an object that has a specific label or annotation, it could also mutate that object to add something. If user X submits an object and it applies label Y for their department. So the components of this, there's a couple different components. And if you look at it, open policy agent's kind of the heart of it. It's what's doing the validation of the different policies you define. The cube management piece of this. Today, this isn't based on CRDs, but will be based on CRDs. So it's watching CRDs for the policy, and it's also providing the K8s object watcher, which is validating that data. So it's just looking at the JSON data and kind of evaluating that against the policy it's been defined. Then the policy controller is what's doing the query against the open policy agent for anything like audit, policy, and emission. And I think I forgot to admit, it can also do a audit, so I can look at a current environment, and I can also audit that against my policies without enforcing those policies. All right, so for the demo here. Okay, so for the demo, there's two different things I'll quickly show here. So one I have is a container image whitelist. So essentially, this is a Rego policy here that I've defined. Within here, what it's first looking at, this is a deny rule. Then it's looking at the type of resources I want to apply this to. So it's looking at any type of object defined as a pod, and it's looking at all namespaces. The resolution is whatever message it's going to return to the user if this is actually denied here. So if I go ahead, I already deployed the policy agent. You can see it creates a few different things like some cluster roles and bindings, creates a service, secret, and config maps. Today, what I'm going to show, the policies here are actually defined as config maps. So you can see I have like an annotation policy, an ingress conflict, these type of ones. They're all going to be defined as config maps today. Like I said, that's being redesigned to be CRDs. So if I go ahead and apply this one, have to open another screen here. All right, so the first one I'll show here is the pod. And the pod I'm going to be using, the object and YAML here, is right here. As you can see, my image name is just BusyBox there. And if I look back at my whitelist is asking for registry.acmecorp.com. So if I go ahead and apply that, okay, so you can see when I try to apply that pod policy, came back with the mission webhook, the name of that webhook, and it says it denied the request for the registry image because it's stated as BusyBox, and our policy says it has to be registry.acme.corp, or at least it needs to start with that. So I can whitelist what registries I actually want to allow users to pull from. The second one is a annotation policy here. The annotation policy, what this policy is doing, it's going to provide a patch on the actual annotation, and it's going to match this object. So anytime it sees an annotation with this test mutation, it's going to also add an annotation for foo with the value.bar. So if I go through this one, all right, so we can see here, this created a deployment here. The only annotation we have on there is deployment Kubernetes.io there. And then the last step I had here was to annotate that deployment. So in here, if I go and get the metadata now, so once I annotated that, with this test mutation. That's what I added in this annotation up here. Once I did that added that test mutation true, it also automatically added foobar here. So a good example of this is maybe you want to allow users to only deploy internal load balancers rather than being able to deploy publicly exposed load balancers. Typically doing that within majority of your cloud environments and other environments is going to be through a annotation. So that would be a good example where I could automatically, when somebody submits a object for a service with a type of load balancer, it will automatically annotate that so it'll only get a internal load balancer. With the mutations, you do have to be cautious with them, because when you mutate an object, automatically mutate an object, your end user doesn't always know what that desired state's going to be, because it's outside of what they define. So you do have to be careful with those. All right, so that shows a quick demo. Last thing here, please get involved in this. I think this provides a huge pain point that a lot of end users in the Kubernetes community have from a lot of people I've talked to. And it would be great to see kind of a whole repository of these different policies, because I think a lot of the policies could be applied across different type of end users in their environments. So you can go to openpolicyagent.org. That's where you'll find all the documentation and tutorials there. They also have a Slack channel where there's a lot of activity in there. So if you're just getting started with this, especially if like the policy language is usually the learning curve, tons of people to help you out there. And they also hold bi-weekly meetings talking about the policy controller and open policy agent. And that is all I have.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate it. We don't really have time for questions, but there's a ton of notes in the demo. Dave, if you could drop your slides in there in the community meeting notes, that'd be great.
Yes,
Next up is His Royal Beardness, Aaron Krickenberger, for our release updates.
Royal Beardness. Okay. Hi, everybody. I am Aaron of SIG Beard, and today is your Kubernetes 1.14 release update. This is week 8. This week's cat t-shirt is the cat that is too cool to look back, walking away from an explosion. Because guess what, folks? We are in burn down. I also prepared slides for today. Let's see how long this works. Okay, so share the thing, go to the thing, minimize that, and try to present. Okay, so welcome to Burn Down, everybody. What is Burn Down? I can click this link and it will take me to our wonderful release 1.14 schedule. And it talks about how the fact that now we want to burn issues down. We want to focus on fixing bugs, eliminating test flakes, and just in general, stabilizing the release. We're going to encourage people who are on the hook to help fix these things to start showing up to these meetings. They are at present occurring Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can get a meeting invite for these by joining the Kubernetes SIG release mailing list if you would like. These meetings are also shared with the Kubernetes community calendar. So, some of you may feel like things are going to get a little intense, and what's the deal with the release team going around and poking all of the things? Well, it's because we actually want to get the release out the door. So we're really interested in taking a close look at whether or not things are really ready to ship, whether they're really documented, whether they really have tests, whether you've really thought about the upgrade, downgrade considerations. So let's go to the enhancement spreadsheet where Claire and the wonderful enhancements team have been going through and poking at I believe it is now 32 enhancements down from the original 40 planned enhancements. And you can see that we have a number of these that are marked at risk. The reason they're marked at risk is because we've gone and poked on the individual enhancement issues and asked folks, hey, do you actually have a test plan? Are you sure you're really planning to get back here? And I'm not like trying to pick on this. This is just the first issue I'm clicking here. But all the way down at the bottom, we have somebody who's really hoping that this makes it into 114, but we don't actually have a KEP that describes how this is going to make it into 114 right now. And the KEP doesn't have a test plan. And if we go to supposedly where the proposal is still being fleshed out, there is ongoing discussion about the design of this particular enhancement. This feels like maybe not the most stable thing to try and jam in a week before CodeFreeze. So that's why we now have, I believe it's somewhere between 12 to 14 enhancements at risk. And if you are the owner of one of these enhancements, or if you know that you are trying to land an enhancement in 114, maybe check your inbox or check your GitHub notifications and make sure that you've sufficiently responded to this. We're going to start putting holds on PRs that are related to these enhancements if we find that they're not really looking like they're going to make it. And huge thanks to everybody who has, in fact, already punted their issues to the next milestone because they know it's unreasonable to land it. Next up, let's talk about docs. So Friday, March 1st, be sure to bring out your docs. Open up a docs PR. Jim Angel posted a message to the Kubernetes dev mailing list and to a couple other places to remind you all to open up a PR against the Kubernetes website repo by Friday, March 1st. You will forever be our special place best friend if you actually open up real full docs by Friday, March 1st. But all we're really asking for is just a placeholder PR. And then finally, the part I'm so excited about, and the literal entire reason I made the slide deck, was to tell you to brace yourself because memes about CodeFreeze are coming. Remember, we dropped the idea of code slush. And so instead of code slush, where we made things a little bit trickier to merge, we just said that we're going to use this week before CodeFreeze, which was previously called code slush, as, I don't know, code meme or something, where we tell you all that CodeFreeze is coming and really think long and hard about whether or not you want to try and land your code before CodeFreeze. So CodeFreeze is March 7th. That's when burn down turns into something a little bit different, where things slow down because everything is so frozen, and we can hopefully start to see a more reasonable pace of change. Things that are going to land after CodeFreeze are things that only have the V114 milestone attached to them. There's none of this priority critical urgent stuff. There's none of this labeling stuff. It's just the milestone. Who can apply the milestone? People in the Kubernetes milestone maintainers GitHub team, which should correspond roughly to the Kubernetes release team and the SIG leads. I guess I should be calling them SIG chairs or SIG technical leads for all of the different SIGs. So some people think, again, CodeFree seems a little crazy and wild. What's going on? It's this super hardcore thing. Other people think that maybe CodeFreeze is more of what you would call a guideline, where we don't actually really mean it. You can sneak in whatever you want. Perhaps some of you are considering pushing a large change right now to try and sneak it in by CodeFreeze, or maybe you want to sneak it in the day right of CodeFreeze. And I also like to live dangerously. But fortunately, I have a release team who's a little bit more considerate than me, always wanting to ship stuff. And so, for example, like, we're not going to be pushing to have Golang 112 used to build Kubernetes 114. Even though it was released a whole 2 days ago, seems like maybe that's something we should wait until the next release cycle to consider. So remember that the code is freezing in here, Mr. Bigglesworth, and think long and hard about whether or not your code's actually going to land. Next, let's talk about diff resources. Why am I so upset about diff resources? Well, let's go take a look at the release master blocking dashboards. This is the one job that runs most of the end-to-end tests against Kubernetes for all the code that's in master right now. And as I keep scrolling to the right, I keep going back in time, and we keep seeing how, like, it started out kind of not failing red all the time. There was a tiny bit of green here and here. But as I keep going forward in time, it's just getting redder and redder and redder. What is going on, you people? Don't you understand? This job actually tells us whether or not we have a successfully tested and launchable and releasable Kubernetes. Well, it turns out this is kind of difficult to fix. I'm not actually trying to pick on anybody, but I am trying to point out that we should really start paying attention to these a lot more, just collectively as a community. But thankfully, we do have a CI Signal team who is also paying attention to this stuff, and they have brought this to the attention of SIG storage. So how do I know that? Well, let's move on to CI Signal, because of course we all know that this is, generally speaking, what the experience of trying to land a change in Kubernetes is like. And we need people to help us out to understand, wait, are these real failures? Are these flakes? What's going on? Who's fixing this bug? Who's responsible for this bug? And so CI Signal has helpfully created a project dashboard, which, as far as I know, should be available to everybody. They even have these awesome instructions on the left-hand side here telling you, like, welcome, would you like to help out? Here's how you can help out. Feel free to contribute, especially if you see something, say something, maybe even go ahead and put it on this board. What goes on this board? Well, it's cards that have kind failing test or kind flake and happen to have the 114 milestone attached to them. You'll notice there's a lot of red on this board, and that's because we are labeling as priority, critical, urgent any test failures that happen to actually definitely be blocking the release, like they're on the release master, blocking dashboard, and any of the sundry jobs that are there. And so that brings me to, like, how did I know that we're paying attention to this diff resources things? Because there's an issue about volume mode test leaking persistent disks. And this seems to be maybe why diff resources is failing, because diff resources diffs the resources the cluster created, the resources that are present before the cluster was created and after the cluster was created and all the tests ran. And if we're leaking stuff, that's why that particular check fails. So shout out to Michelle for getting on top of this and making sure that SIG Storage, who's continually awesome, is troubleshooting this. Hopefully we can get this brought to ground shortly. There are a bunch of other things, and because we're kind of running long, I'm not going to walk you through all of these tests, but just to say that, like, if you're on this board, people are going to come and talk to you and ask, like, what's going on? What can we do to help? Who do we need to poke to move this forward? Finally, I just wanted to give another quick, brief shout out to Jeff, Shadow in the release notes role, who kind of made a plea that perhaps this time around, the release notes for Kubernetes should actually be about the release. If you take a look at the changelog for Kubernetes 1.13, it's basically about what each and every SIG did. It almost looks kind of like a written dump of every SIG's community meeting update. And why is that in a repository called Kubernetes in a file called changelog? Shouldn't that really be about the release? So he did a couple things about this. First off, if you want to see what the release notes look like today, you can take a look at the release notes draft that is continually published by the release notes team. They were doing it on a weekly cadence, and I believe we talked about bumping it up to at least bi-weekly at this point. And you can see even right now, it's maybe what some of you are familiar with. There's an action required section. There's a new features section. And then there's this section down here where, like, literally every SIG has their name attached to everything. And I feel like maybe this is incomprehensible to end users. And this seems like it's a little dense to sort through. So Jeff also started a personal project that he suggested maybe SIG Release should take on as a sub-project to try and consume some JSON that comes from a tool written by Mike Arpaia, who is one of the 114 release shadows, and turn it into this, like, interactive site where you can click around and filter things by what matters to you most. And then what I don't have anything to link to, but I think is a great idea, is respect the release notes team. Let them have an editorial voice. I give them full power and authority to actually try and create some kind of narrative out of this crazy herd of cats that's having an army of monkeys banging on typewriters, banging out code and documentation. Like, somebody at the end of the day has to try and have that make sense to end users. So quick shout out to that. And I think that is all that I have. And I've had my screen share this entire time. I have no idea what's going on in chat. I'll stop sharing. Any questions?
No
Okay.
questions? Sounds great. Thank you, Aaron.
I will link the slides in just a second.
Appreciate it. Next up, contributor tip of the week, Jordan Liggett. But I don't, oh, there he is. Jordan, take it away, buddy.
Great. So some of you may have seen comments show up on your pull requests in the last week advising you that your pull request might need an API review. And in the past, this was kind of a secret handshake kind of process. If you needed an API review, you would know, and you would get it by asking someone, and the person you would ask, you would just know. And if you didn't know, you would need to ask around. And we're trying to improve that. So if you saw this comment show up on your pull request, it would link you to a document describing what pull requests need API reviews. And if you need one, how do you get one? And once you are getting one, what is the process for that? And so I put notes in the community doc. There are links to those descriptions and an example of the comments that the bot will leave for you. And the idea is to make this process transparent and lightweight, and hopefully make it easy for people to get involved when they need it on their changes. So if you saw that show up, follow those links, read that. If you have questions, reach out to SIG Architecture. They're the ones that are driving the API review process, and give us feedback on that. We'd be happy to hear it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. Any questions? All righty. Moving along to SIG updates. So if you're a SIG lead and you're in this call, check out the community notes, or the community meeting notes. There's some tips about what to cover during these. There's even a slide template, and there's a schedule as well. But first up is SIG cluster lifecycle. Tim, are you around?
Hello.
Hey, there he is.
1 second here. Hopefully folks can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. So we'll give a brief update. I'll try to make this quick because I made my slides really quick. So what do we do, just for the PSA for folks who are new contributors? SIG Cluster Lifecycle's objective is to simplify the creation, configuration, upgrade, downgrade, and tear down of clusters and their components, which basically means we pass butter. So what are we doing right now? What's coming up in the 1.14 release cycle? There are some highlight reels that I want folks to know about. So in 1.14, there are several major sub-projects that kind of sit under the umbrella of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. KubeADM is one of them. So for 1.14, there's better test automation. Lubomir did a ton of integration work with using Kind as the default deployer for being able to test updates to KubeADM. And we're starting to investigate what it means to do upgrade testing too as well, but that's not going to land in 1.14. That'll probably be a 1.15 plus timeframe. As folks who are aware of this effort, for several years we've had the question of what does it mean to be a chicken egg with regards to HA, and over time we've had a good story, but it keeps on evolving and becoming cleaner and simpler. We have several improvements that are going on this cycle, and every single iteration it gets a little bit cleaner, a little bit simpler, to the point where we want to have a single control plane join command, and magically you have HA. Last but not least are the modification to the join subcommand that exists inside of KubeADM to break it out into multiple phases. So those who build turnkey automation around KubeADM, which there are many tools that do that, can use the join, the different operations in the join subcommand to do customization as they see fit, and a number of bug fixes. So what's going on in Cluster API? Cluster API is another major sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Where KubeADM stops, Cluster API begins. I won't give the synopsis there, but I highly recommend going to the sub-project page if you want to know more. The TLDR is that we are going to be releasing a V1 Alpha 1 in the near term, probably around the same time or same-ish time frame as 1.14 release. One of the problems with releasing asynchronously from the mainline is that, especially with multiple repos, we're working on a methodology and process that we want to follow for doing releases. There are documents that are posted, and I'll put the slides inside of the main community doc too as well for folks who are interested. There's a bunch of ongoing work with regards to cleanup of machine deployments and machine sets. We also talked about how to do this a little more gracefully, and that work is going to be going into V1 Alpha 1. Just for folks who are aware, we have about 17 more open issues, and we could actively use testers. So if people are interested in testing out what's latest and greatest and coming in Cluster API, as well as the different providers, we would love to hear from you. On to MiniCube. MiniCube has released a v0.34 update, a bunch of cool features and additions. There's one minor regression that exists on AMD chips. There's details in the repo as well as in the slide deck that outline the detail there. There's as well as ongoing support for multiple CRIs. And they're going to aim for a V1 release in the last week of March. So if you're interested in helping out in MiniCube, or if you want to use it and want to be able to test out features, please talk with the MiniCube team. They'd love to hear feedback. Couple of other sub-projects. Kind is not necessarily a sub-project of SIG cluster lifecycle, but we actually have a ton of people who are executing against Kind, so we want to give a minor update there about some of the things we've added in. For COPS, the PSAs COPS is now upgraded to etcd3. They're currently working through the latest CVE for runC issue. They're working also through the integration of cluster API, and that means that there's a bunch of other follow-on work that kind of falls through that integration. And in the long-term picture, in the long-term arc of COPS, as Justin likes to say, is that it's meant to live outside of the scope and build upon the other tools so that eventually it will reduce the scope of COPS itself over time. So that would be great. So one of the big foundational principles of SIG cluster lifecycle is composability. And as we kind of start to break down the layers over time, what we find is that the scope of each individual tool becomes smaller, and it becomes much more of a composable problem or composition problem. With regards to Kind, folks have added offline support. They're upgraded to the latest version of v1.13.3 release. And Ben is currently working on a monthly cadence. I know there's been a bunch of other features that the cluster lifecycle folks have added, primarily because we want to be able to use Kind as the default testing tool for developers. Here's my long-term goal. I would love to use Kind as the tool that replaces local cluster up for every Kubernetes developer. We're not there yet. So what are some PSAs about some of the other working groups and sub-projects? There is a component config working group. If you don't like knobs and you'd like to reevaluate your life choices, we highly recommend going to talk with that group. Because there is a lot of work to do. And please reach out to Lucas and Mike Talfin if you're interested in helping reduce the state space of configuration options that exist, which, if you look at the API server, there are hundreds of knobs. We're starting to think seriously about add-on management. No, we're seriously serious this time. For those who have known this space, it has existed for a long time, but we kind of have a forcing function nowadays, which is the CRD lifecycle. And we are going to be working on that probably in the 1.15 timeframe. As I mentioned, HA gets more better every single release. We're going to probably have a simpler, cleaner UX experience and probably try to promote the HA feature to beta in Kubernetes. Last but not least, in cluster API land, for a post V1 Alpha 1 world and a V1 Alpha 2, we're going to plan to re-architect some of the pieces of the puzzle there and try again, as you could probably tell from my previous statements, is aim for a more composable model to kind of coalesce the provider fragmentation that exists. So what's coming up? The answer is we have planning. So if you are interested in engaging in SIG cluster lifecycle, in the beginning of every cycle, we go through a planning phase. And you can look at the backlog currently for what already exists in some of the milestones to get an idea of what's coming up. But if you care about a feature and you want to see it land in a given release, we highly recommend going to a planning session, which will happen in the next couple of weeks. To get an idea of how we do these things, there's a link to the grooming document, which actually outlines our process that we follow for a lot of the sub-projects in SIG cluster lifecycle. Where can you find us? You can add us on the channels. There's a homepage, which is in the community repo, or used to be in the community repo. I guess this slide deck is old. But if you look in the community repo, there exists a link there which outlines all of the different sub-project meetings and the channels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to be routed to anywhere, just go to the SIG cluster lifecycle channel. We'll help find you a happy landing zone. That's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Next up from SIG OpenStack, Chris, he will probably mispronounce your last name, Hogue.
Hodge, yeah, thank you.
Hodge, thank you.
All right, I will, I'll share my slides here. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So my name is Chris Hodge. I'm right now I'm the chair of SIG OpenStack. We are in the process of adding 2 more co-chairs right now. There's a flight, there's a patch in flight for that, which I'll get to more a little bit later. So to start off with, what is SIG OpenStack? We try to coordinate the cross-community efforts of the OpenStack and Kubernetes communities. And so in our minds, this covers 3 distinct use cases. The first is OpenStack is a free and open source deployment platform for Kubernetes with integrations provided by cloud provider OpenStack. And so there are a number of different cloud providers within the community, and we develop the OpenStack specific version of that cloud provider. Also with OpenStack as providing infrastructure services for Kubernetes clusters. And so we're seeing a number of use cases where we're in production, OpenStack identity or storage, block storage or object storage, secrets, networking. Kubernetes isn't necessarily deployed on top of a cluster that has these services, but it might be consuming these APIs. And so in this case, it's Kubernetes and OpenStack running side by side. And finally, as a collection of infrastructure applications strung on top of Kubernetes. And so one of the methods that we're seeing within the with larger adoption in the OpenStack community is setting up a bare metal Kubernetes cluster, that is kind of operator only, and putting cloud infrastructure on top of that. So the OpenStack Helm project and the Airship projects are examples of where this is happening. We have a little diagram of this, which kind of illustrates that this really isn't one or the other. It's actually a whole stack of things that live with one another, from starting from their bare metal and moving all the way over to the delivery of cloud infrastructure. So what are we doing in practice right now? Well, one of our biggest tasks is maintaining the cloud provider. It has Cinder and Manila CSI drivers, Keystone, authentication, authorization, webhooks, ingress and egress controllers through Octavia, and Barbican KMS plugins. Another big focus of our efforts is actually removing the entry provider from Kubernetes. And so this has been in flight for quite a while now. We pretty much have a patch that's ready to go. The last bits of effort that we have on this are largely related to collaborations that are happening with SIG Cloud Provider. We're also building deployment tooling, and so we have hosted Kubernetes on OpenStack clouds with Magnum. We've seen a tremendous amount of success in production with this. We have a few public clouds that are running it, and we also have CERN, which is running an OpenStack cluster. And at last count, there were over 400 Kubernetes clusters running on top of their production research OpenStack cloud, which is pretty exciting. To see the uptake of Magnum as hosted Kubernetes service. We also have projects that are doing self-service deployments with COPS, and so this feeds in nicely with SIG Lifecycle, the presentation that they just gave. We have an alpha implementation of OpenStack for COPS, and we also have a cluster API implementation for OpenStack clouds. And we're going to be working on a bare metal implementation of that too. That's backed by the OpenStack Ironic service. So this just kind of covers again some of the integrations that the cloud provider offers: networking, load balancers, routers, block storage, metadata, as well as secure key value storage. So, as we stated before, one of the biggest goals is to completely remove the entry code. This work is in collaboration with SIG Cloud Provider, and a lot of it now involves identifying the entry dependencies and moving them into staging. And a big shout out to Walter and Andrew, and some of the other SIG Cloud Provider folks for identifying these and doing the work on that. This is touching a lot of the providers, and we're mostly ready to go. We're just pending these common structural changes, and our goal is to actually be completely out by the end of 2019. This is much later than we had originally intended, but this is more in line with the larger cloud provider, landscape. And this also allows time for people who are using the in-tree cloud provider code in production to transition away from using that to using the external provider, because there is a little bit of extra work that needs to be done to bring those up to speed. Cluster API is in progress, and this is actually a pretty exciting effort, and we're really happy to be involved with it. It's very fast-paced. We're looking for more developers and more robust implementations, as well as help with the COP support. And it's great to see the COP support moving along, and the power in having single deployments from the command line. Simple deployments from the command line. We're also looking at, we just started a new SIG within the OpenStack community for that's focused on bare metal. And one of our focuses is going to be on delivering a bare metal driver for the cluster API, so that the nice thing about Ironic is you can run it in several modes, including a standalone mode where it knows about your resources. You have direct command line access to it. But you can also run it in an integrated multi-tenant cloud-like mode. So you're essentially treating bare metal like a cloud, like a virtualization cloud. So we think that there's a lot of opportunities to be able to have some pretty good integrations with these kind of cloud-like services that Kubernetes expects to be able to run successfully, and also bringing the power of bare metal to that. We have support in place for more than a dozen open hardware types and boot interfaces, as well as a number of proprietary hardware types. And we also have advanced features like hardware discovery. So you can actually point Ironic at your bare metal cloud, at your network, with credentials to log into the servers, and it'll actually discover the resources and capabilities that are available on those servers. And so that's pretty exciting too. We've also had a pretty long historic collaboration with SIG testing, and we've had end-to-end testing in place for a while now, and we're using that to gate against our own processes. One thing that came up recently was some articles that came out this week about work that the CNCF and the Kubernetes community are doing with respect to performance testing of different network and cloud architectures. I would say the one thing that concerns us about this is, doing a first pass at the results is we don't entirely understand the methodology, assumptions, or goals of what's happening with this work. In particular, we've noticed some, inconsistent deployment types, as well as dated deployment technologies, which I don't think shines a favorable light on OpenStack and its actual potential. So we kind of wanted to ask SIG testing and the Kubernetes community in general just about, we wanted a deeper understanding of what the community commitment and goals to this are. And it's all very new to us. And so we just have a bunch of questions, and would welcome any assistance from the community on understanding this.
That's a really good question that probably deserves a longer answer than we can afford to give in this forum, but I am in agreement with you. I think it would come down to a question of who owns and is responsible for the continued maintenance and whatnot of running this. For example, there are efforts the CNCF does in the CI space for its cross-cloud testing, for example, that have literally not a thing to do with SIG testing. So I think it is, as usual in this project, a question of who is willing to pony up the resources and staff and, people and time and all that good stuff.
Yeah, completely understandable. Cool. So we're coming up to the end of the time. If you'd like to find out more, if you'd like to get involved, we have a Slack channel. We're at SIG OpenStack on Slack, as well as a Google group, Kubernetes SIG OpenStack. We have a patch in flight to add a couple new co-chairs. The first is Christoph Globitz from Innovo Cloud in Germany. The other is Flavio Percoco from Red Hat. And we're pretty excited to have them both step in and take leadership roles within the SIG. And with a minute left, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. All right. Thanks, everybody, for your time.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Next up is Mike Dines with SIG Off.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Denise. I am a chair of SIG Auth, and I'll be giving the SIG Auth update today. So at SIG Auth, we're chaired by Tim, me, and Mo. We just elected some TLs. So David Eads and Jordan are TLs with me. And we have various sub-project approvers and many sub-project reviewers. The list almost goes off the screen. So we have probably the same set of sub-projects identified as we did last update. So I'll skip over this. But what we're actually driving technically, we're working on a rollout of improved service account tokens. So over the last couple releases, we have built infrastructure to provision service account tokens that are time-bound and audience-bound, so they can be used more securely and against clients that are not just the Kubernetes API server. So we would like to eventually replace the old service account provisioning infrastructure through secrets with this new token provisioning flow. So we're working through how to do this with minimal impact to clients. We're also working on a dynamic audit. So this feature allows configuring audit syncs through a dynamic admission webhook. We're also taking a deeper look at some of the policy objects that we have in Kubernetes today. So we have many different policy objects like limit range and pod security policy and network policy. The APIs and how people interact and understand these things are kind of disjoint. So we're looking at either rethinking some of these or allowing extensions like the one we saw earlier in the demo to really take advantage of the admission webhook functionality and have a more consistent story around some of our policy objects. So if you've noticed, pod security policy has been around for about a couple of years at this point, and it's still in beta, and that's because it has some pretty fundamental usability issues. So we're also working on API server authentication. There's an open kept out. So we have this new mechanism for extending Kubernetes, which is these dynamic webhooks. Often webhooks deal with accept sensitive data, return sensitive data, or do expensive work on behalf of a webhook. So we need a way to for these webhooks to authenticate the API server in these flows. And we would also like to bring more of the APIs that have been around for a little while to GA. So the certificates API is something that's been in beta for 3 years now. And it's fundamental to many of the Kubernetes setups. So setups that are using kubelet TLS Bootstrap, which is probably I would say the majority of setups at this point are depending on the certificates API, and it is still beta. The token request infrastructure, we would like to get to GA so that we can start migrating clients onto new and improved tokens and better secure these tokens. So organizationally, we have recently identified sub-projects and TLs. We're looking into more intentionally and proactively driving progress on these sub-projects. So we're in the experimentation phase to figure out how we can engage the SIG more and make sure that these sub-projects are moving forward in a steady manner. Sometimes our sub-projects have floundered and we could do a better job at tracking. So we're kind of learning, trying to take some lessons from other SIGs that have more structured engagement, such as SIG cluster lifecycle, and we're going to think about what standing items in SIG auth meetings that we could put in place to make sure that these things are getting the attention they need. So recently, we also reabsorbed the Container Identity Working Group. We had this working group for about a year. A couple good things came out of it. Most of the service account token infrastructure was developed and designed collaboratively inside that working group. We also got some items on the CSI path to GA ticket that would help integrators that are using the container storage interface to build identity solutions. So we decided that we kind of achieved what we wanted to achieve in that group, and we weren't, it felt like there wasn't enough content to justify having a separate meeting from SIG auth. So we decided to reabsorb container identity into SIG auth. So you can find us in the SIG auth channel. We meet every week at 11 Pacific time, or every other week at 11 Pacific time. We have a mailing list, so feel free to engage with us and ask us questions. We have a good first issue label that we are trying to keep up to date. This is something that we might try to more proactively apply during our bug scrubs. So if you're interested in getting involved with SIG auth, there's also a number of sub-projects that we could always use more contribution. And we're always looking for new contributors.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Any questions? No. All right. Moving along to announcements. In general, we need more Slack moderators. There's a link for folks to apply to moderate all the Slacks for the Kubernetes world, which is not an easy undertaking, but would appreciate all the help you can get. You gotta be a K8s.org member already, and APAC and EU moderators are mostly the ones that we need. So please apply to help out. Are there any other announcements in general before I move on to shoutouts? Aaron, you have nothing? Wow. Anyone else? All right, cool. All right, shoutouts time. Akoots, major shout out to Catherine Berry at Catherine for fixing a UX bug within just a few hours of me mentioning it. Wow, cool. Ain't no service like SIG testing service, because SIG testing service don't stop. Aaron Krickenberger, shout out to Thomas Runyon for a pull request allowing us to run make test command what equals deployment to run just the deployment CLI tests. Same sort of thing you can do with make test and make test integration. Oh, nifty, thank you. Ben the Elder, shout out to Guinevere Sanger for writing a wonderful new message for the welcome bot. It is very lovely. Looking forward to seeing this in more places. Check out the link there. It's pretty cool what we did, or what Gwen did for us. Ben the Elder also, shout out to GFE for really shiny and useful looking structured Kubernetes release notes viewer demo in today's SIG release meeting. Looking forward to seeing more about this. Maria, shout out to Sylvia Maropina for putting together a workflow to enable CI signal subteam of the release team to keep on top of flagging issues from end-to-end tests and coordinate follow-ups, and to Jorge Alacron for spotting an opportunity to offer broader transparency to what the CI signal team is working on, suggesting a structure and kicking off implementation. Find current version at link in the notes. Jorge Alacron, I might know that person from a previous life. Aaron Quickenberger, also shout out to Josh Burkus for taking notes during today's steering committee meeting. Our Google Doc clearly becomes way more difficult to use with so many people looking at it, and the written record is invaluable. Aaron, also shout out to Catherine Berry for moving us from Kubernetes to Spyglass for all our test results viewing needs. There's a link in the notes there. Cotton Roden, a shout out to Michelle Au, I don't know how to say that, AU, for her patience and helpful guidance in getting a very large PR merged. And Dave Schriebel, shout out to Jiffy and Oyin Yang for all their awesome work on the release notes team for 1.14, especially Jiffy's work on the release notes website concept. I will +1 that. Anything else before we are done? Nothing. All right. Thank you for coming, everyone. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day.